Welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity today to find out a little bit about their journey, the events that have shaped their career, maybe those things that still keep them up at night. Today's guest has taken a truly unique path through the cybersecurity landscape, from tracking down leaked albums and movies to working hand in hand with Oliver Stone on movies like Snowden and Savages. Ralph Echemendia, better known as the ethical hacker, has spent his career at the fascinating intersection of technology and entertainment, helping Hollywood get hacking right while also protecting the digital assets from real-world threats. So if you've ever watched a hacking scene in a movie or a TV show, and be honest, you're thinking of Mr. Robot right now, and thought, wow, that's actually accurate, that's actually a good scene, then you've probably got Ralph here to thank. Alongside his technical expertise, Ralph has become a trusted advisor on how the entertainment industry shapes our global understanding of privacy, security, and the very nature of hacking itself. Currently, Ralph's focused on helping high-profile clients manage their digital reputation in the emerging threats in the world of AI, deepfakes, and all kinds of new digital threats that are out there. Ralph brings a perspective that bridges the technical and creative worlds in ways that few others can. So, Ralph, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dennis. It's a pleasure.
No, my pleasure's mine. One of my co-hosts on this, Mark Mayfrey, we often refer to him internally at Beyond Trust as the Hollywood hacker because he was once on MTV in the late 90s, early 2000s. But I think we've actually found a real Hollywood hacker here, which is yourself. So delighted to have you on.
Oh man, happy to be here and happy to talk about this. It's been a fun ride, and certainly one that was certainly unexpected.
So let's talk about that ride. Where did that first begin? What first sparked your interest in technology and cybersecurity?
You know, it actually started really more as a hobby. I had a friend named Homer, and Homer and I, back when we were about 13, 14, 15, somewhere around that age, he got me into ham radio first. Him and his brother and his father were into ham radio. And so first it was that kind of piqued my interest into, well, how does this all work? And how come we can listen to people across the world and listening on the police at the same time? So getting into and understanding how radio frequencies worked and that technology was the first kind of door that opened. And then it was phone phreaking. So still it was, not really. The computers kind of came in shortly thereafter. And I remember it was kind of, funny here, but in all honesty, he said, if we can get a computer, we can use all our phone phreaking tricks to dial BBSs in California. They have porn. And at 14, I was like, really? I guess we need a computer then. And I asked my mom for a computer for Christmas. And that was a Commodore 64, the first computer I had. And of course, there was no, you got this machine and plugged it in, and it just kind of blinked at you. There was nothing really telling you what to do with this thing. So, luckily, my friend's brother was already in IT, if you will, working for the school system. So we had him to kind of ask questions to, and that's kind of how it started. Like I said, it was really just a hobby, and eventually that hobby took me to, and I ended up getting a job as a secretary, technically, for a public relations firm. And it was there that I had no idea, no clue about that there was any kind of, and mind you, this is very pre-cybersecurity. This is just IT, in those days. But I didn't even know what that was, to be honest. It was just, I happened to know the software. I happened to know how to use the computer and the hardware and so on. So I ended up as, like I said, as a secretary for a PR firm, which I didn't really even know what that was, a PR firm. So, and that PR firm turned out to be representing Lexmark when they broke away from IBM. And that sent me on trips to South America because they were doing all Latin American PR for Lexmark. And it was there that I met they were, setting up all the printers for their launch. And it was there that I spoke to an engineer and I said, hey, do you know that the protocol that is used by these printers has no security and I can make the printers print whatever I want? And the engineer looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, let me show you. And then I pulled out my old brick of the Toshiba laptop and showed him. And he was blown away. He thought it was like magic. I was like, no, I explained the protocol, blah, blah, blah. And he said, where do you work? And I said, the PR firm. And he said, well, what do you do? So I'm a secretary. And he said, why? And I said, what do you mean why? And that was the first time that I had a conversation with, another technical person other than my friend, and outside of the BBS world, as far as other hackers, right? But I had never met anybody face to face. And he basically said, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be working for us. And I was like, well, the truth is I didn't graduate from high school and I didn't go to college. So I can't go work for IBM. And he said, no, we don't know. I don't even know what you did. And I'm an engineer at IBM. So I'm going to give you the name of a recruiter. When you get back to Miami, you call this recruiter and you just do what he tells you to do. And so I did. And then my first job after that was at Oracle.
Well, you jumped in right at the deep end there as well. So it's not just into some small IT firm, some small thing. You went right from the kind of tangential PR industry straight into Oracle. What was that like as a culture shock for you?
Oh, it was quite shocking because I had no idea who Oracle was. And here I walked into an office that was literally it was Oracle's Latin American headquarters, which are based in Miami. And it was a whole floor. And so I'm like, what is it we do here? You've got, a conference room with cameras and stuff. I'm like, what exactly is it that Oracle does? And they're like, databases. I'm like, databases. Okay. And there I was, responsible for basically Unix systems. And I now had access to Unix systems that were, that I would never have access to, Sun Microsystems, Hewlett Packard systems, all kinds of, commercial systems that I never before had access to, but I knew Unix, Linux, whatever. And same thing happens. Here I met some incredibly genius guys, programmers who were working at Oracle. But I would show them that I could send them an email from their boss and they would freak out. And I was like, well, that's easy compared to what you just showed me. So it was the first time that I started to really kind of go, well, even in a company of that size, and again, this is kind of pre-internet blowing up. This is still pre-internet. So they thought this was magic. They thought this was the most incredible stuff that I was showing them. I was like, how come I can access source code on your servers in California, but people from the office in Argentina can't check their email correctly? Like, getting into all those little details, I found a lot of security issues, but the word security still didn't exist then, to be honest. It was all IT, and MIS, Management Information Systems. But cybersecurity was unheard of. And even just using the word security was not really heard of. So I just jumped around there for a few, between Oracle and then a big publishing company in Miami. And then eventually ended up working where security, the word first time security really came up was I ended up working at Miami Children's Hospital, deploying the first electronic medical charting system in the world outside of NASA. At the time, NASA was using it. And it was there that, I'm working really with nurses and doctors, those are my user base. And so I have a lot of questions, as you can imagine. And what if this happens? What if that happens? Especially when it comes to interfacing this system with all these other systems, admissions, discharge, transfer, lab systems, and all these different things. And it was the first time that I, raised the question, well, what happens if a medical chart is changed after a discharge? And they looked at me like, that's not possible. And I was like, it is possible. I can change a medical chart. And if I can do it, that means it can be done. And they said, no. At the time, this system was run and owned by Motorola. And they said, no, Motorola said that's impossible. I said, well, let me show you. Sit down. Go look, give me any patient chart, any patient you want that's been discharged, and I'll make them dead. Which you should not be able to do, right? So I did, and they were freaked out and immediately contacted Motorola, and that led now to a process of I would call it responsible disclosure. And again, these were things that were, you know, we kind of hacker nerds knew about this terminology, but this wasn't yet truly a commercial business, cybersecurity. So in fact, the commercial firewall had not been released yet by Check Point. So, yeah, I spent a couple of weeks out in Arizona fighting with engineers because I wasn't going to tell them exactly how I did it. I was only going to tell them that this is a problem and just give them enough information so that they would really fix the problem and not just fix what I did. Um, and then that was kind of an interesting process of fighting with these guys. But eventually they figured it out, and I went back to Miami to the hospital, and I was called into a meeting by the head of the entire hospital, and all these doctors were there, and they said, "Congratulations, we're changing your position from point of care system administrator to security officer." And I thought, wait, isn't that the same title of the guy at the door with a gun? And they were like, well, yes, for your security officer for the IT department. And I said, okay, come with a raise? They said, yes. I said, great. Does it come with a gun and a uniform? They said, no. I said, well, I'll take the raise then. And, and then shortly thereafter, that's when the firewall came in. And then I was responsible for deployment of firewalls and that intrusion detection systems into the hospital. What I realized was, and again, I was still as a hobby with my friends, quote unquote, hacking. So, applying that knowledge to the hospital and security in there, and the tools that, again, these companies didn't know of. Most of this was open source at the time that we were using. So applying all of that led me to eventually realize that most engineers and other people I met really didn't know anything about this stuff. So eventually I wrote a class along with other hacker friends, and that class eventually kind of became the beginnings of what later became certifications in the space of penetration testing. First class I wrote was called Applied Penetration Testing. And ended up actually, there's a good friend still to this day, a gentleman by the name of Pete Herzog. He runs ISOCOM and wrote the open source security testing methodology manual. And so along with him, I ended up getting the East Coast for the certification. And my first actual training was the U.S. Marine Corps Red Team at Quantico. So that was the first time I actually taught the materials. And that, just ballooned into, for about 5 years, between, it was 3 weeks a month, 1 week off, and for about, 3 to 5 years, nonstop training and teaching and doing certification. And that other week would end up being consulting. So that's really when cybersecurity started to take shape as an industry. And that's been my path, basically. That it really kind of started with training, and then doing a lot of public speaking and things of that nature. But Hollywood happened in a weird way, because I know that's where you're probably going. Is okay, so.
Well, yeah, we needed to lay the groundwork, because I mean, we could do an episode on your pre-Hollywood interactions, pre-entertainment interactions, because I think it's fascinating how, you just go and, you're talking to someone about a printer that lands you a first job at not anywhere, just Oracle, you look suddenly in the office there, you do some training courses, your first, clientele, the people you're delivering it to, in the Marines, all these things, in Quantico, all these things going on, you're quite at the front of it. And one of the interesting things is, you mentioned, your background there, growing up in Miami. And whenever I've visited Miami, people often describe it as, vibrant and creative, but actually there's that real mentality from the Cuban community that's a real hacker mentality in the true sense of the word that I see, where people are able to achieve goals and solve problems that other people maybe aren't thinking about. They're taking an innovative approach. How much did that kind of Miami culture shape your approach to cybersecurity and later the interactions in the entertainment industry?
I think that's a very good point that I never give that much thought, but you're right, because, the thing is, within the Cuban culture in Miami, especially too, is you make do with whatever you got, and you make, and you make things do what they weren't necessarily written to do or do. I mean, look how many people came over in rafts and rafters, as they call them, from Cuba. I have a cousin who did that, and I often would tell her, "Girl, you got bigger balls than I do," because he spent 7 weeks in the ocean on a raft. When she came in, she was literally burnt to a crisp. Um, but I mean, that takes some balls, and it also takes some ingenuity to see, to use things that, again, are not necessarily things that are used to travel 90 miles across the streets of Florida. So I think that kind of mentality is definitely there to, even till today, you have cars in Cuba that are running on kerosene, and they're 1950s cars. They figure out how to make things work. And I think that that's definitely a factor that I never even thought about until you brought it up now. Um, but also, most people don't really think of Miami as being a place that would have hackers. But interestingly enough, especially when I started even with BBSs, it was California, sort of like the West Coast, some Seattle, some, Portland, but mostly it was really California and New York that I had other hacker friends. And this is only on the BBSs. And of course, a lot of us have kept in touch. A lot of us have become professionals in the field, but Miami did have a bit of an underlying of hackers, and by that I mean not just folks like myself who professionally figured out a way to do it, but also criminals, which is a bit of Miami too. One of the biggest credit card hacks was done by the Green Hat Gang, which was a group from Miami. So it was always there. And in fact, for a few years, I ran a DEF CON group in Miami called DEF CON 305. And unbeknownst to me, some of those guys were in my DEF CON group meetings, so I would see that, it was very much a subculture. That's now become, something that the movies talk about and use, like Mr. Robot, which I, to your point, worked on as well. But, most people don't expect that when you go to Miami, but it is, in fact, that's why the whole Oracle thing, it is I would say it is the capital of Latin America. It might be in Florida, but that's really what Miami is. So you see all of these major companies having their headquarters in Miami for Latin America. So that gave me access to a whole lot of things there. And really, something I failed to mention before was my true passion and love. I used to be a sound engineer since I was 15. I first started DJing and then being a sound engineer at clubs. So yeah, I technically shouldn't have even been in those clubs, but I was doing sound for, you name it, all these big clubs in Miami, from salsa bands to, at the time, disco was still sort of going on in some of the clubs on the beach, and South Beach was starting up. And like I told you, the computers are a hobby. I was actually making money and had, a couple $100,000 worth of gear at the age of 16, 17 when I was doing sound. But, later when I got married, I thought, that business was a bit shady, the people I dealt with. So I said, okay, the idea of what you're going to do when you grow up. So I sold all that stuff and said, well, I've got these skills, and that's how I ended up at the PR firm. So now take that fast forward to many, many, many years later. I went through a divorce, and at that time, I was really kind of flying real high in the cybersecurity world with the training and consulting. I got a lot of press at the time that had really put me on a more public platform, I would say. So just beyond the nerds, right? So it really was, on one side I'm flying high, on the other side I'm dealing with very difficult personal situation. And I decided to kind of just step back from cybersecurity for a while. And what happened was I started a ticketing company for a friend who was a promoter, and he had a little known festival called Ultra Music Festival, which was a massive EDM festival. I didn't know what it was because I've been married for the last 13 years at that point. So
stayed out of the clubs.
Yeah, I had not been at the clubs or following what electronic music had done. And I ended up, along with my good friend and partner, another hacker programmer friend of mine, George, and we ended up starting this company and doing music festivals, ticketing for music festivals. And now I was thrown right back into that. And it was through that I ended up meeting, I'm a big fan myself of Bob Marley, and I ended up becoming very close with the Marley family in Miami because they had a show that we ended up doing the ticketing for. And it was through that. And again, typically the ticketing guy is not going to end up hanging out in the studio with Damian Marley. But interestingly enough, they heard I was a hacker, and that was of interest. So I did end up hanging out with Damien in the studio and having conversations about Napster at the time. And, and basically all of a sudden I was just there in that environment, which is a very different environment than any other environment with computers. Right. So, and start asking questions. And, oh, well, what is this? Pro Tools. And where does the music go? Hard drive. Where's the hard drive? Does it have RAID 0 or RAID 5? And they look at me as, what? So it was an eye-opening thing to see that none of those things that I knew that come from the corporate or commercial world were really used in studios. And it gave me a lot of insight into studios. And then fast forward, I went back into cybersecurity, left the ticketing company. It was just too much work for too little money. Sounds like fun. It is fun at first, but then it's not. And so I went back and started working for one of the biggest companies in Miami at the time, called Terramark, a big data center company. And through there, we had a lot of different contracts, including with the U.S. government and a lot of other interesting companies, including a private intelligence company. And very early on, after rejoining, I was assigned to a case in Los Angeles. That case was not an entertainment case, but it did put me in Los Angeles for about 3 to 4 months. And I now started, you're in LA, you're going to end up meeting, obviously, people in the entertainment industry. So they were more interested in my stories than they were in my ability to secure them, to be honest. So it was through there that I met a lot of different people. And then shortly after that case, I got a call to fly to Detroit because of a certain rapper being hacked and his music being on the internet that's not supposed to be. And so that's how I ended up, doing the Eminem case and basically tracking down who hacked him, who hacked them.
That's an interesting one to dive into because people probably know that the Eminem song "Lose Yourself," but at one point there was a lost album that you were brought in to come and help look for. So you've obviously got this wonderful bridge where, you've been invited into studio with, Damien, Junior Gong Marley, and you have all these connections and understanding of the technology and the processes they're going through to record these tracks, to store them, to do them. So you've probably got an idea of where to start looking in these things. How did you first actually start that investigation? Because I'm guessing when there's that much money and reputation at stake, you weren't the only people that had been brought in to look into this.
Well, I was part of a team. So I was, what they would call technical lead investigator, but then you have a lead investigator. And then underneath the lead investigator, I kind of work for him. And then you have several other investigators. And this case spanned the world. I mean, it wasn't a U.S. issue. The hacker was abroad and so on. But, the first things you do in any case is really to assess what has happened. A lot of questions that are asked. And I think starting right there is where I started to realize, as well as my investigative partner started to realize, well, Ralph is kind of a unique one because he's not coming in here dressed in a suit like we are. And so, even though they technically work for Eminem, it still feels like the cops are in the building. And that's that doesn't really work very well in studios. So, I tended to be able to get more answers or more honest answers during this first, part of the assessment. And, and it was just through that you start to find out, okay, where could have this music come from? And especially when certain songs were never meant to be released, and where certain songs were released that were never mixed that way. So that they must have had access to stems, as they call them in Pro Tools or in the music business. So, you start to put all that together until you figure out, okay. And of course, Marshall's team is pretty tight, has been the same team. So, and they've been attempted to be hacked before. So, they were pretty tight. But then you realize the music starts moving and it goes back to California and Dr. Dre's team and into different studios. And that's where you start to see, oh, wow, there's a lot of different places where this can be. And it took some time. It took several months. And it also took, at the end of the day, this was a crazy fan. And when I say crazy fan, I want to be careful about saying this. Fandom is crazy. Okay, so it's a bit, if he's not doing anything wrong in his mind, he wasn't. Really, all he wanted was, an autograph from Eminem. So we used, some producers to chat up with him. There's a bit of social engineering that was going on to ultimately be able to track back where this individual was. And ultimately, he was a very young kid in Saudi Arabia.
Wow. And what was the reaction from kind of the people you were working for when this was revealed as to be the source and the issue that they'd found?
Well, I'll give it to Marshall for the way they chose to handle it, because they chose to keep law enforcement out of it. This was handled entirely privately, and it was handled so that even, the worst repercussions especially under Muslim rule, would have been that this kid would have had a chance chopped off. This is considered theft. So it was handled very privately. Yes, we literally went there, took the computer and everything, but it was handled, I think, very appropriately, because at the end of the day, this is just music. Yes, there's a lot of money involved, but it's not worth chopping somebody's hands off or putting him in jail at 16 years old.
Yeah, I assume that along the way, by the sound of it, the music industry, like so many other industries, is quite often naive to technology and cyber threats, that you were probably finding a lot of potential attack vectors that could have led to the release of that album, including the one that actually did. Were there things that you were helping them to actively shut down? Were there some like real shockers in that process?
Yes. We redid the entire studio operations. All of the computers were hardened. They had never really heard of that word, of doing hardening of all of their devices and things of that nature, and just increased logging and more visibility over any traffic that was going in and out. Where it got difficult, as it always does, is more of the policies and procedures and the humans that don't follow it, really. And especially in those environments, it's very hard to do. And then, shortly thereafter, it was Twilight. The last two movies of Twilight were being filmed, and they got hacked and leaked, or pieces were. And same thing, looking at the attack vectors, looking at where this data lived, and so on and so forth. And again, it was a fandom thing. It was a fan going after it. So again, they chose to take legal action against this person. And interestingly enough, here's where you get into all of them, to your point about how, well, first of all, I would assume, right, or I did assume, that, an industry that we all know and love, the film industry, the music industry, you would have some level of security, right? Some level of security.
Well, with the amount of money that floats around in those industries, the amount of investment, you would think there'd be some people wanting to guarantee that their intellectual property was being secured. Yet often when you step into those environments, that is completely forgotten about that. So the process goes out the window. People are bringing in their own devices, bringing in their own samples, connecting all kinds of things together. What was that experience like there?
Yeah. So, for example, in that investigation, I found that so, you've got the studio on one side, and the studio is really just a bank. It gives money to the production to go make the movie. The production doesn't have an IT department at all. Everything the production is using is leased or personal. So to your point, you've got hundreds of people on set. Everybody's got their personal cell phones. Everybody's taking pictures or video, and not just, really for work too. This is not just for, everybody's been sworn to secrecy or be quiet about it, but these are iPhones and Samsung devices and whatnot. This is not, there's no hardening here. There's none of that. And then you've got all of this leased equipment, right? I can't tell you how many times I found in the process that leased equipment went back with film footage on their cards, not even formatted. I found that there were two sort of positions within the production team that you could consider that I thought were kind of IT related. A DIT, digital imaging technologist, nothing to do with IT. That basically is just the person who's coloring, correcting, and working with the camera folks. And then you had, what they called the data wrangler. And I thought, well, maybe that guy is technical. No, he's part of the camera department too. He's just moving, the stuff out of the camera into hard drives and copying it into multiple hard drives and moving it up to dailies to be seen by the studio. So there's a big disconnect between the studio, which does have cybersecurity in the IT department, and the production, and they don't cross whatsoever. So I found it really interesting that this just wasn't. And then so many third-party services are being used. So many different platforms are being used for where the dailies are uploaded to Dropbox till this day. Okay, entire movies are sitting, and when I say the movies, I don't necessarily mean the footage, but I mean everything associated to it, all the financials associated to it, all of the phone numbers, all of the call sheets, all of this information, sitting on Dropbox. And it's just mind-boggling to me. So having to deal with that on Twilight was, digging into all that and at the same time learning all of this, right? And that was kind of the interesting transition with Oliver, was that it was right after the Twilight case that I was in LA working on a fraud prevention case for another major studio, is all I can say. And I happened to meet an art director, which I had no idea what that means. A production designer, had no idea what that meant either. He's still my friend to this day, and he's a very well-known production designer. We worked on, I don't know how many movies that we all know and love. And it was he who eventually, after me digging into what does that mean, art direction and production design, he eventually asked me, what do you do? And I responded with computer hacking and cybersecurity. And he said, well, man, I'm working on a movie right now. I need your help. It's with Oliver Stone, and it's called Savages. And there's some hacking scenes, and I don't know what that looks like. So that's eventually what led for me to then meet Oliver, who I kind of met before with Damian Marley once in the studio. And they wouldn't remember me from then. And that's it. Oliver and I became good friends. I worked on Savages initially on those scenes, but really was just he had me read the entire script, give him input on everything, and then shortly thereafter we stayed good friends during that time. In other words, we hung out quite a bit. I moved to Los Angeles, and then he said he wanted to do something in the world of I'd say, I wouldn't say hacking, because he was looking at things like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. He tends to deal with some very politically charged things, and so he was looking at that world of whistleblowers and whatnot. And Snowden had not happened yet. Okay. But it was right in between that and right after Savages. I said, you know what, man, come to DEF CON with me. And so I took him to DEF CON. Yeah. And he brought his, a couple of his producers and writers, and we all did DEF CON, and they did it up. They experienced all of DEF CON, and then some. And it was very interesting, because there was part of, there was a room of people that me and my a good friend of mine, another hacker friend, put together, and there was a lot of different people in that room, right? To the range from, your very young kid to, your very old, white-haired, scientist-looking guy, and everything in between that you can imagine. These are all people who have been going to DEF CON that are part of very well-known groups and things of that nature. And Oliver was asking a lot of questions, right? As Oliver would, as he is really more of a journalist, right, and historian. And I remember a couple of interesting things that are then relevant to later the Snowden thing happening, which was, at the time there was a lot of talk about whether the U.S. government could listen on your cell phones, and Oliver was asking about that, because when he walked into the room, we were asked to put our phones in a metal box, and everyone's phones were in that metal box. And we explained to Oliver that we were doing that to ensure that we could have a candid conversation about whatever. And so eventually that question came up, but it came up towards the end of it, after he had been asking many different questions. And there was one guy in the room who, wearing just khaki shorts and a polo shirt, had kind of taken control of directing, the questions and answers in the room. And eventually, and we talked about things like the hacker manifesto and the hacker ethic and, subculture stuff about the hacking community, which, as you know, they're not pro-corporate or pro-government. So,
or pro media sometimes either. So it's interesting to bring out someone from that industry in. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he was asking a lot of questions. It started more along those lines, but then eventually, the question was asked about, well, is it true that the NSA can listen in on our phones? And the same guy had been talking this whole time, answering a lot of these questions about the culture and subculture. And so, said, yes, that's why we asked you to put your phones in. Everybody's phones are in the locker there. And then he said, well, how do you know that? How do you know that for a fact? And this individual said, because I work at the NSA and I wrote the program that listens on your phones. And then Oliver, interestingly, said, what? I'm really confused here. Whose side are you on? And this guy, interestingly enough, responded with, I don't think you understand. Where we come from, there is no sides. And, Oliver still did not understand that. He said, no, I can't accept that. What side are you on? Are you on their side or my side? He said, there is no sides. We're all one and we're everywhere. And we're not going to let bad things happen to good people because we are everywhere. And interestingly enough, that conversation was had about 2.5 months later, the Snowden disclosures happened. And we met with Bill Binney. Well, we were at DEF CON, which is one of the original NSA whistleblowers. He had been in communications with Assange. So he was looking at what to do. He wanted to do something about this in this space. And then, boom, Snowden happens. I worked for one of the companies that those programs that were mentioned by Snowden. So when I heard that, then I was like, this is a bombshell a bit. At least it is for those of us who knew what that program was and that, talk about those programs. So, then it just went immediately into, very quickly, he got the rights from different places. And then I started working with the writer. So he and the writer would go to Russia, come back from interviewing Snowden. This happened several times. I was invited, but I chose not to do that. And they would come back and we started working on the script. So I worked with Kieran Fitzgerald, who's an amazing writer, and Oliver. So write the script very quickly. And then we went straight into pre-production in Munich, Germany, where we did most of the filming happen. And then straight into production shortly thereafter. And in between that came Mr. Robot. So Mr. Robot was happening in between that I just mentioned. And interestingly enough, my input from Mr. Robot was, I learned a lot from Hollywood, which was, excuse my French, but shut the fuck up sometimes, because you give a lot of information to these writers and they know how to write and write and write. But any credits I even got for the first 5-6 episodes of Mr. Robot were because of a journalist who happened to be there when I was asked to do a speech presentation at Anonymous Content, who was producing Mr. Robot. But my management went back and forth with Anonymous, and in the end, we made no deal. But they used everything I said in Mr. Robot. And thanks to that journalist, I still got my sort of credit for having made Mr. Robot realistic.
So, there's a lot to unpack here, but when we talk about the world of cybersecurity, we often talk about how busy and overwhelming it is for people. And when we hear about, movie productions, TV productions, you often hear the same, they've got schedules, times to deliver things, lots of moving parts. And it strikes me your involvement is probably the worst of it all, because you are both on the technical side, worried about maybe how they're securing the processes, devices on set, all that kind of things. You're also helping out with writing. And I presume you're also, like you say, giving speeches and presentations, because there are actors delivering hacking scenes who maybe don't know anything beyond their iPhone, that you're having to educate on. This is kind of why you're doing it. This is why this dialogue matters. This is even what this word means in a scene. What was kind of your involvement across the whole thing, and how did you manage your time?
Well, interestingly enough, see, Savages I was coming right off of the Twilight case. So Savages worked out where he wanted me to basically advise him on the script, on making this stuff realistic, on what was going to be on the screens and so on. And my interest was, I actually want to follow the film from the camera all the way through the process, because Hollywood has a lot of money put into what you call piracy. But piracy is really only defined after the release of the intellectual property. And so that intellectual property has to be already copywritten, if you will, right? Which was interesting thing, was one of the issues with Twilight, which was they tried to hit this girl up that who was from Argentina, with a copyright infringement case. And they lost for one very interesting technicality, which is, if you happen to get your hands on footage from a film being filmed, that script starts being, when the filming begins, the script is, say, version 1. By the time that you finish filming the movie, there may be 300 versions of changes in that script, and they have not been copywritten yet. So they just chose to go after her for the wrong thing, because at the time when those things were released, they were not copywritten materials yet. So they lost the case against that girl on the Twilight thing. And so my interest was more like that, being an outsider as an investigator on those cases. Yet now I was an insider, part of the crew. So that was part of the deal with Oliver, was, you can't afford me to do what I need to do on here anyway. I just want you to give me full access. And he did. And so now I knew that. And when we went into the Snowden, I said, into filming Snowden, then it wasn't just about the actual content itself. It also became about the actual process of where the film led, and basically the management of all data assets associated to the film. And so, to your point, just being on set, all right, I had all of these people who can now come up to me and be like, I have a problem with all kinds of normal stuff that people have an issue with, or just questions. So just by being on set, it created a more safer and secure environment. But on Snowden, it was tenfold. We provided the systems for all file transfers, for all data, and asset management, with very high levels of granular logging to ensure that nothing could be leaked and nothing could get out. And so it wasn't just, there was two parts to that. And, again, learned a lot through that process, but honestly, not many films do that. Like I told you, most of them tend to use a lot of publicly available platforms.
With Snowden, was there a heightened sense of security? Because you mentioned before that, the album leaks, the Twilight leaks, it was the fandom that are going after it. Now, when it comes to Edward Snowden, his fandom or his enemies list are rather different, more sophisticated threat actors. So, whereas, obviously it's a movie and a documentary about it, but there are people who probably have interest in what you're going to be saying, how you're going to be presenting the facts. What was the security concerns around Snowden?
Oh, James, you would be surprised. You would be surprised to how many different attackers we had here. We were being attacked from directions that were not what you would think. You would think it's normal for, say, the NSA or the US government to want to know what's going to be in the movie. So we had that. But then we also had it from the other side, believe it or not, because there were people on the other side who also had, certain interests in the film. So we had, real hackers or hacking groups, as well as, state-sponsored groups from not just the US, but other states who were trying to just gain access to anything. So we designed this to be very off the grid. And for the most part it was, but we still got to see all the attempts. We kind of created a bit of a honey net situation. So we still got to see a lot of what people are trying to attempt to do, but it was pretty eye-opening because we wouldn't have expected some of these parties to be trying to access what was being filmed or what was going to be told. Because I think that was the main thing is what was going to be told and how was it going to be told. And that's what they were interested in.
Yeah, I guess there's also a lot of kind of hacking groups who just want the credit of leaking some information from it just because of the connection to the kind of the scene and being the first to get something out there would be a thing, as well as all the nation states and other interconnected organizations. Well, when we talk about security, one of the things we often talk about is that need to drive security, but also balance usability. I imagine that is even more precarious a balance to undertake in a film set where everything is under pressure and delivering things. How did you manage to ensure that things were done in a secure way? I believe it was like one of the first fully digital productions Oliver had done. How did you make sure that all the technology and everything could deliver on what it needed to do for the users on the set without compromising on the security?
That was a real balance that had to be met. And it's a real, that's where you come to really realize that this issue of security is truly it's not a technological one. Those are just kind of tools, but it's really a human problem. It's a human issue. And so it took a real balance because, to your point about usability, these are now folks that I can come in and say, okay, everybody got to use now wine.com as an email. So anything associated to this project, not going to happen. They'll sign any piece of paper and say that they're doing it, but they're not really doing it. And if you do, you end up creating barriers to the creativity of that group of people. And these are some of the most amazing people in the areas that whatever it is they do, from hair and makeup to you name it, okay, to visual effects. They are incredibly good people, and they're very incredibly good at what they do. But the usability, the moment you start putting too many hurdles, or security in front of it, it really is going to affect the creativity. So it took a real balance. And when I say that, I mean, it was very one-on-one. I didn't know because I don't come from film or music that way, but I didn't really know the level of power I had, especially on Snowden. I was the only person who could just be next to Oliver anytime, all the time, even during things that I didn't know were serious, like a private rehearsal. I took me several times before I said, why is everybody outside? And they're like, oh, is it a break? And they're not private rehearsals. Only the director and the actors are allowed in there. And why am I here? We don't know. That's never happened. So when you had that level of access, then, like I said, it was very one-on-one, from Joseph Gordon-Levitt to many of the actors who I had personal relationships with and are still personal friends, to, like I said, most of the crew, because, I wanted to make sure that we were using the tools and using the systems that we created for obviously for providing security, but also not to get in the way of their process and creative flow, if you will. And so there was no way to do that like in a blanket kind of way. There was no way I could just go, okay, everybody, you got to follow this rule. It really became down to working with every department head and getting into what resources they were going to be using of this platform that we had created. And then kind of just in a very human way, training them to use it. And in a very human way, making sure they were using it, but not really like your typical security officer at the corporate environment would. It was very personal.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the things that shines through from talking to you and doing the research for this podcast, that you aren't focused on the technology like so many people often are in this industry. You're focused on, well, what is the consequences from this? Whether it's I can make someone appear to be dead after they've checked out of the hospital, or that you talk to the people, you understand their problems, you understand the flows in the studio and why these things are happening. What do you think people should think about when we're thinking about cybersecurity in organizations? How do we balance kind of the technology and just, is it a thing we should lead with, or is it just a tool that we can have in our back pocket to focus on the human problems?
Well, I think especially when we talk about cybersecurity across organizations worldwide, especially in enterprise environments and corporate environments, where we're too often like some kind of we come across a bit too much like like a nasty bodyguard. You know what I mean? Like, and yeah, and it's always like it's also almost a bit of the attitude of like, what, you don't understand what I'm telling you? You don't understand how this works? We almost talk down to our user base, um, and I think that's a human problem. That's not a technological problem. Like I said, all the technology and all the tools exist. They have existed, and they've gotten better in many different ways. But the people problem has not necessarily gotten better. Um, it also is, you got to be careful in building paranoia in the process. You know what I mean? I think we too often, not too often, even still to this day, the sales of cybersecurity are based on FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt all the way, and that's not the business I wanted to, I made a conscious decision to make sure that I stayed away from FUD at a very early stage and focused on trust. You have to trust me, and I talk about this in many of my keynotes about the importance and understanding of what trust is, because I don't know, I'm not a mechanic and I don't know much about cars. So if my car starts making a sound, I take it into a mechanic, and the mechanic says, well, this is not good, and this is not good, and this is not good, and I found this too, and the guy turns around and tells me it's going to cost $6,000. Well, do I trust him, or do I take it to another mechanic? And if I take it to another mechanic, that mechanic may say the same thing, and I still have to choose who I trust, right? So if you don't have the knowledge and you don't have the skill set for whatever it is, and most people don't, when it comes to these issues of cybersecurity, you're going to have to put your trust in someone. And I think the big misconception is that trust is put into a company. No, trust is put into the people of the company, and not the company. Okay, the company is just a thing around the people in the company. So the products are just a thing around with the people in the company. This becomes a very human issue for anyone, because, like you said, the repercussions or the outcomes of a hack is somebody's entire life now, and that goes now all the way to the CEO, and we've seen it happen, right? So um, like I said, I think we've been focusing for, I tend to put it this way. When, some of the stories we were talking about early on, right? Where, like, for example, in the hospital, right? Well, cybersecurity was really was like just not even a baby yet. There was a semen and an egg at that point, right? When I was told you're the security officer. And 10, 15 years later, it does not age like a human does. Cybersecurity ages more like a dog or less, because 15, 20 years later, that was still a baby, right? And I would say that today cybersecurity is a bit of a rambunctious teenager. So the truth is, cybersecurity is not mature enough yet, in my opinion, for it to be, and I wouldn't say taken seriously, but it is taken seriously, but it's primarily taken seriously because it has to be. It's not because it is. It's only taken seriously because there are, compliance and regulatory and all kinds of different laws in place that make people, and have made people that did not exist when I got started, have made companies have to do X, Y, Z, and have to budget for these sort of things. But as far as a true understanding of it, um, I don't think is entirely there yet. It's still like, your teenager stole your car, and you're not going, why? You could have just asked for it, right? So it's kind of there now. It's starting, I think, to get it. So it's, a little bit beyond teenager now. Love the way I kind of explain cybersecurity. Um, but it's still not there. It's still not mature.
So before, like, obviously you've seen it from the conception up to its now rambunctious teenage phase. You've dealt with, these fandom leaks and all these challenges of media going out there. But like we sort of hinted at the start, we're now in an age where actually maybe you don't even need to leak the footage of a high-profile individual. Maybe you can just deep fake it. Maybe you can just create something that damages their reputation without ever compromising a system. So how are you working with clients now to help them safeguard themselves with this rambunctious teenager of cyber issues today?
Oh, that's a great question, and a loaded question, because the world has changed because of that, and AI in so many different ways. I am dealing with so many different issues. I mean, I primarily today what I end up handling, or what I end up really doing mostly, is I tend to sit on the board of companies as an advisor to the board, because the executives, I can translate this into terms, and especially into financial terms for the board. But then the other stuff I tend to do a lot of is what I call privacy and reputation management. And a lot of this has to do with what you just said, especially for neither high net worth families or famous people, is really the majority of what I do in that space now. And it's a matter of trying to get ahead of what will eventually happen with a lot of these folks, which is that AI is going to be used against them somehow. The deepfakes are going to be used against them. You know, um, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're having issues around even the definition of intellectual property now, right? And how it's used. I mean, if case in point, if right now as we're going through this, if I was using sort of a note taking tool, AI tool, uh, I'm talking about things that may be IP, my IP or your IP. And that's in the note taking AI app. Now I hacked that app, and I got access to all kinds of IP. So that's just one example. Not to mention, jailbreaking, if you will, AI. Dark GPTs and all kinds of other things that are used, uh, that now in conjunction allow an attacker a multitude of different attack vectors and expand the surface of those potential attacks in such a way where the impact to the, say, famous person and or high net worth individual is compounded at such a level that we couldn't have thought of 10 years ago, right? A lot of that you just deal with crisis management PR in the past. Now it's become where that's just a little piece of the puzzle of what you have to deal with in case of a crisis, right? And what we're trying to do is actually protect people from getting to a point of a major crisis. So this issue of reputation management um, is a whole new world, and that's pretty much all I do these days. It's literally what we call privacy and reputation management, because the word privacy by itself has not been properly defined. So I have to go through in a very human way with every one of these clients to identify, what do you think privacy means? Oh, my password should be private. Well, have you ever shared an ethics password with your daughter? Well, sure I have. Then that's not private. you know, my email address. No, your email address is not private. Your phone number, that's not private either. Your name's not private. So let's go down the list, and everything that most of the time my clients tend to think is supposed to be private is not private. It already isn't private. So getting to the point of actually defining that, and then putting, whether it be tools, but a lot of times has to do a lot with kind of educating them, then, putting tools around them, but then educating them, has a big part to do with it. But it's a new thing. It's a real problem. I think even more so than somebody hacked my phone, somebody hacked my computer. I mean, I'm seeing everything from very complex attacks that are put together with AI, uh, scamming people for a lot of money, on a global scale, to people who you would think are in the crypto world and have their wallets stolen.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto gone. That's how good deepfakes can get.
Well, if anyone listening is interested in learning a little bit more about you, or maybe they're interested in some of the services you're talking about there, what's the best way to reach out to you, find out more information?
Just Google my name. I'm on everything, so you'll find everything out there, from LinkedIn to Instagram. There's WhatsApps and Telegrams and all that kind of stuff. My information is pretty easy to find once you look out there. So, yeah, I'm very accessible.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today on Adventures of Alice and Bob. A big thanks to our guest, Ralph Echemendia, otherwise known as the Ethical Hacker, for sharing some of his journey with us today. And more importantly, making sure that people like myself can actually enjoy hacking scenes in movies and TV shows without wanting to throw things at the screen. NCIS, two people on one keyboard scene, I'm looking at you. That was awful. But thank you very much for everything you've done, Ralph.
I didn't do that one.
You didn't do that one. No, that's the low watermark there, and you've set a much higher bar when we've seen things like the productions you've been involved with. As always, thanks to our super producer Jesse and the team here at Beyond Trust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maude, and this has been Adventures of Alice and Ralph.
Thank you for listening to the Adventures of Alice and Bob. Do you have any stories from the cybersecurity trenches that would make our listeners' jaws drop? If so, we would love to have you on the podcast. Maybe you faced down a ransomware attack with nothing but coffee and determination, discovered a breach in the most unexpected way, or had a pen test go horribly wrong. Whatever your tale, funny, harrowing, or just plain wild, we want to feature you on the show. To share your cybersecurity war stories, email us at booking@merchantsmedia.com.